The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under a blanket of white, the December wind howling like a wounded animal across the frozen plains. Jonas McClure pulled his worn coat tighter as he guided his horse through the knee-deep snow, his weathered face stinging from the bitter cold. At 52, he had spent more winters alone on his ranch than he cared to count, but this storm felt different, angrier, more unforgiving. "Easy there, Buck," he murmured to his chestnut mare, patting her neck as she struggled against the wind. The town of Clearwater was still 3 miles away, but Jonas had made this journey countless times. What he hadn't expected was to find a body half buried in a snowdrift near Devil's Creek. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree branch, dark against the pristine white. But as he approached, Jonas's heart sank. It was a young man, probably in his 20s, with long black hair matted with blood and snow. His clothes, traditional Lakota buckskins, were torn and stained crimson. "Lord have mercy," Jonas whispered, dismounting quickly. The territorial conflicts between settlers and the Lakota had been brutal, leaving deep scars on both sides. Most folks in Clearwater wouldn't stop for a wounded native, especially not in weather like this. Jonas knelt beside the still form, checking for signs of life. A weak pulse fluttered beneath his fingertips. The young man's eyes opened briefly, dark brown, filled with pain but also surprise at seeing a white face above him. "Don't you worry now," Jonas said gently, though he wasn't sure the man understood English. "I'm going to get you somewhere warm." The journey back to Jonas's ranch house took nearly an hour. The injured man draped across Buck's saddle while Jonas walked alongside, fighting against the storm. By the time they reached the modest log cabin, both men were barely conscious from the cold. Jonas had doctored plenty of wounded animals over the years, and some people too. His late wife Sarah had been the real healer, but she'd taught him enough before the fever took her 5 years ago. As he carried the young Lakota into his home, memories of Sarah's gentle hands and healing words came flooding back. "Sarah always said every life has value," he muttered to himself, settling the wounded man onto the bed in the spare room. "Guess she'd expect nothing less." The young man's injuries were severe: 2 bullet wounds, one in the shoulder and another that had grazed his ribs. Jonas worked by lamplight, cleaning the wounds with whiskey and hot water, his hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. Outside, the storm raged on, as if nature itself was holding vigil. "What's your name, son?" Jonas asked as he bandaged the shoulder wound. The young man's eyes were open now, watching Jonas with a mixture of wariness and gratitude. "Ayana," came the whispered response. "It means ... eternal blossom." Jonas nodded, understanding that this was likely more than a name. It was trust being offered. "Well, Ayana, you're safe here." "I'm Jonas, you just rest now." Through the night, Jonas kept watch, stoking the fire and monitoring his unexpected guest. He knew that harboring a wounded Lakota could bring trouble from both the townspeople and the territorial authorities. But as he looked at Ayana's young face, peaceful now in sleep, he remembered what Sarah used to say. "Jonas, when God puts someone in your path, it's not by accident." The storm began to subside just before dawn, and Jonas stepped outside to survey the damage. Snow had drifted against his barn, and several fence posts would need repair. But none of that mattered now. He had a decision to make, and he knew Sarah would have expected him to choose compassion over convenience. When he returned to check on Ayana, the young man was awake, struggling to sit up. "Easy there," Jonas said, gently pressing him back down. "You've lost a lot of blood. You need to rest." "Why?" Ayana asked, his English clear despite his weakness. "Why help enemy?" Jonas considered the question for a long moment. "Because you're not my enemy. You're just a man who needed help, and I happen to be the one who found you." For 3 days, Jonas tended to Ayana with the devotion of a father caring for his own son. He prepared broths from beef and wild herbs, changed bandages twice daily, and sat by the bedside, reading aloud from his worn Bible and Sarah's collection of poetry books. Ayana listened intently, his dark eyes following Jonas's movements with growing trust. "My grandmother," Ayana said on the second evening, his voice gaining strength. She spoke of whites with good hearts, said they were rare, as buffalo with white fur, but they existed. Jonas chuckled softly. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. What happened to you out there, if you don't mind my asking?" Ayana's expression darkened. "Soldiers. They said we were stealing cattle, but we were only passing through to winter grounds. My horse was shot, and I thought I would die. Alone in the snow." The weight of that statement settled between them. Jonas understood loneliness intimately. The long nights when the wind seemed to whisper Sarah's name, the meals eaten in silence, the conversations held only with his horse and the occasional traveling merchant. "Nobody should die alone," Jonas said firmly. "That's not how the good Lord intended it." On the third day, Ayana's condition took a turn for the worse. The fever that had been kept at bay suddenly spiked. An infection began to spread, despite Jonas's best efforts. By evening, it was clear that the young Lakota was fighting a losing battle. "Jonas," Ayana whispered, his hand gripping the rancher's arm, "I need to tell you something. My people ... They know where I am." Jonas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What do you mean?" "Before the soldiers I was scout. My band ... followed at distance. They watch, but they see your kindness. You could have left me to die, but you chose mercy." That night, Jonas kept vigil as Ayana slipped in and out of consciousness. The young man spoke of his family, a wife named Winona, a daughter barely walking, an elderly father who had taught him to track deer through the deepest snow. He shared stories of his people's traditions, their connection to the land, their struggles to maintain their way of life. "We are not so different," Ayana said during a moment of clarity. "We both love deeply, we both grieve, we both hope for better days." Jonas nodded, understanding that this conversation was more than just words between strangers. It was a bridge being built across a chasm of misunderstanding and prejudice. As dawn approached, Ayana's breathing became labored. Jonas held his hand, offering what comfort he could with his presence. "Jonas," Ayana whispered, "thank you for seeing me as human." Those were his last words. Ayana passed away just as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin window, his face peaceful, no longer marked by pain or fear. Jonas sat in silence for a long time, still holding the young man's hand. He thought about the choices that had led to this moment, his decision to stop to help, to offer comfort to someone most of his neighbors would have considered an enemy. When he finally stood, Jonas knew what he had to do, despite the risk too. His reputation and safety, he would give Ayana a proper burial. It was what Sarah would have expected, and it was what his own conscience demanded. He spent the morning preparing the body, according to what little he knew of Lakota customs, wrapping Ayana in his best blanket and placing a sprig of sage that Sarah had once gathered for their herb garden. The ground was too frozen for digging, so Jonas built a burial platform on a hill overlooking the valley. Just as he had seen done by other tribes. As he worked, Jonas felt watched. Several times he glanced toward the tree line, catching glimpses of movement, shadows that might have been men on horseback. But no one approached, and no one interfered. By sunset, the burial was complete. Jonas stood before the platform, hat in hand, and spoke a simple prayer. "Lord, take this young man into your care. He died far from his family, but he didn't die forgotten. May his spirit find peace." Jonas returned to his cabin that evening, emotionally drained, but at peace with his actions. He had done what felt right, regardless of the potential consequences. As he prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, he reflected on the past few days and how they had changed him, the loneliness that had been his constant, Companions since Sarah's death felt different, now less bitter, more contemplative. Caring for Ayana had reminded him of his capacity for compassion, of the connections that could exist between people despite their differences. Sleep came hard that night. Jonas found himself listening to every sound outside, the wind through the pines, the settling of snow on the roof, the distant howl of coyotes. Several times he thought he heard horses, but when he peered through the frosted windows, he saw nothing but the silver-white landscape under a clear, star-filled sky. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, and began his morning routine of feeding Buck and checking the fences damaged by the storm. The winter air was crisp and still, no longer carrying the violent edge of the blizzard. As he worked, Jonas noticed tracks in the snow around his property, many tracks, leading in different directions. It wasn't until he had finished his chores and was walking back toward the cabin that Jonas saw it. There, planted firmly in the snow beside his front door, was a lance decorated with eagle feathers and strips of beaded leather. Attached to it was a piece of deerskin with symbols painted in red and black, clearly a message. Though Jonas couldn't decipher its meaning, his heart pounding, Jonas looked around the property more carefully. The tracks were everywhere, evidence of many visitors who had come and gone silently in the night. But nothing was disturbed, nothing was taken. Instead, small gifts had been left: bundles of jerky wrapped in bark, a pair of beautifully crafted moccasins, and a medicine pouch that smelled of sage and sweetgrass. The sound of horses approaching made Jonas turn toward the road. 3 riders were coming from the direction of Clearwater, and as they drew closer, he recognized Sheriff Hawkins and 2 of the town's prominent citizens, Mayor Garrett and banker James Morton. "Morning, Jonas," Sheriff Hawkins called out, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk." Jonas stepped forward, prepared for whatever confrontation might come. But as the men dismounted, he noticed something extraordinary. Each of their horses carried a small pennant, strips of cloth in the colors and patterns of various Native American tribes. "Jonas," Mayor Garrett said, his usual stern demeanor replaced by something approaching awe, "you need to see what happened in town." They rode together toward Clearwater, Jonas's confusion growing with each passing mile. As they crested the hill overlooking the settlement, he pulled Buck to a halt, scarcely believing what he saw. Every house, every shop, every building in Clearwater flew a tribal flag. Some were Lakota, others Cheyenne, Crow, and Arapaho, a rainbow of colors and symbols fluttering in the morning breeze. The entire town looked as if it had been transformed overnight into a monument to Native American heritage. "They came in the darkness," Sheriff Hawkins explained. "Must have been 50 or more riders moving like ghosts. Nobody heard them, nobody saw them plant the flags. But when folks woke up this morning, it's like nothing I've ever seen, Mayor." Garrett added, "At first, people were scared, thought it might be some kind of threat. But then old Widow Henderson found this beside her flag." He handed Jonas a piece of bark with charcoal markings. Though Jonas couldn't read the symbols, their meaning was becoming clear. "It's a message of respect," Jonas said quietly. "They're honoring something." "Honoring what?" Sheriff Hawkins asked. Jonas looked back toward his ranch, where Ayana's burial platform stood silhouetted against the morning sky. The idea that all lives have value, that kindness doesn't have to know borders or colors. As they rode into town, Jonas saw the faces of his neighbors, confusion giving way to understanding, fear melting into something approaching reverence. Children pointed at the flags with wide eyes, and adults stood in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about the night's mysterious visitors. Martha Jenkins, who ran the general store, approached Jonas as he dismounted. "Jonas, we heard what you did. Taking in that wounded brave, giving him a proper burial. Most folks around here, well, we wouldn't have done the same. Maybe that's something we all need to think about." Jonas replied. As the day progressed, the story spread throughout Clearwater and beyond. The image of an entire town adorned with tribal flags became a symbol not of conflict or division, but of the possibility that existed when human beings chose to see each other's humanity. Jonas returned to his ranch that evening to find one final gift waiting by Ayana's burial platform, a single white feather, the kind his grandmother had told him appeared when a spirit had found peace. Standing there in the gathering dusk, with the flags of Clearwater visible in the distance, Jonas finally understood that his 3 days with Ayana had changed more than just his own heart. Sometimes he realized one act of kindness could plant seeds that bloomed in ways beyond imagination. The loneliness that had defined his existence for so long had been replaced by something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that compassion, like hope, could spread from person to person, community to community, heart to heart. As he walked back to his cabin, Jonas whispered a prayer of gratitude for the storm that had brought Ayana to him, for the courage to do what was right, and for the reminder that in a world too often divided by fear and misunderstanding, love could still work miracles.